We're going to spend a little time talking about single subject research. I think this one will probably resonate with you the most because it's very largely tied to, it doesn't have to be, but very largely tied to how we might monitor and manage client change. Um, so think about maybe what's appealing to you about single subject research as you've been reading through the chapter. What's a strength? What's a drawback? Because both, I think, are positioned within this research design. So it really is an N of one. When you're thinking about looking at data and tracking, change over time, um, we're thinking about this one person. Now we can bring those one people together sometimes in many ways, but we're just thinking about this one person at this point in time and thinking about how change has occurred. So are you seeing this at your work or at your field placement? Do people do this sort of formalized research or evaluation? So group level research, which we're headed into, can tell us about what most people do to improve with a particular intervention. This can tell us whether one client is improving. So it is very connected. We're not trying to think about generalizing to other people or thinking about how this might work, this intervention might work globally. Can we unroll it into other areas? But did my client change with this intervention? Have we achieved maybe treatment goals related to what we've set? So it really is about this one person. So again, in our assessment phase, and we think about, doing the work, the teaching and learning, that we think about what's the concern. We're establishing some goals. Those are your dependent variables. Those are the things you hope change based on your intervention. You operationalize, we've talked about that, into specific things we're going to measure. We come up with a plan, we select an intervention, and then we monitor that change over time. So an example, child is having temper tantrums, and the goal is to reduce those behaviors, those tantrums, those outbursts, right? So we might want to operationalize tantrum as an outburst, as we either want to look at number of them per week. We may want to think about the number of minutes that it lasted, or maybe we're more concerned about the intensity. Like, we're okay if there's a release of energy in this way. The intensity is what we need to manage because it's becoming too much for parents and teachers, things like that. So thinking through those pieces. If we wanted to do a more positive strengths-based approach to this, maybe we focus on when the child is compliant, right? And really maximizing the times when they are able to be redirected, or, however that might look. So that, just to flip that on its head a little bit as we're thinking about this. So next, we develop a measurement plan. So who's going to be the source of measurement? How many measurements over what period of time, right? So is it going to be parents? Is it going to be parents and teachers, because kiddos aren't with parents or teachers 24 hours a day, right? And thinking through those pieces so we know when we're having this intervention, right? Once we decide upon that, who's going to be able to tell us what's happening? If you want to triangulate, you could maybe, again, use different measurements or different people getting that. Does it seem to only happen at school, not at home? What's different about school? If it's happening in both places, what's maybe leading up to the tangent? Is it because they're redirected or they aren't able to, release energy in another way? What's happening here? And thinking through those sources of information. Hopefully we can kind of get a baseline, a series of measurements taken before the intervention, so that we have a better understanding if the intervention is the source of change. A guideline, a series of 5 measurements is useful. We can say the more the better, sure, so we can get that really solid baseline, but often we don't have the luxury of that. Self-report can be used. It is subjective to bias. If we're saying, of course I exercised, I considered that walk from my car to the grocery store entrance, that was exercise, right? And maybe that's included in your operationalization, maybe it's not. And so again, how we might self-report can impact that. how can you can minimize that bias with hopefully unobtrusive observation, right? But that can sometimes be hard. If you've got somebody, an aide in the classroom that's maybe helping doing this, maybe the kiddo knows, maybe it is intrusive, maybe that changes the behavior in a way that is different from the intervention, right? So again, thinking about doing that and who's going to observe these changes. Retrospective baselines are sometimes used. Again, they can be biased. You're doing it based upon memory, but sometimes again we can't wait another 5 weeks, 5 months, whatever, to get this baseline data. So sometimes we need to think back and think through that. The last step of phase 2 is to chart the data and assess the pattern, right? So once we've done this intervention, we're starting to collect that data, and we've got to be consistent and again operationalize this. So if I'm thinking that walking to the grocery store is exercise, the other observer, if there are more than one, is also thinking that walking to the grocery store from your car is exercise. And just think about, why is that baseline data so important? What if in this class I would have given you a pre-test on research knowledge, and then we did a post-test on research knowledge? That baseline, right, that before anything happens, can definitely give us some insight into something that often is anecdotal, which can have some limitations to it, right? Just even looking back sometimes at notes from meetings and what you thought you recollected and what you wrote down at the time can be like, oh, well, that was kind of a different experience, right? So that's the very beginning part of single subject research. In the next video, we'll start to talk about some designs.